Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file's being recorded for the September 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 25, The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or buy me a coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So 25 is the third and final chapter in part 7 of 8 of Capital. That's a lot of numbers, but basically this is the last chapter in part 7, the accumulation of capital, in which Marx basically puts together everything else in the book. And then the last part, part 8, is primitive accumulation, which concerns how capitalism gets established. Part 8 is not always included in every version of Capital that you'll see out there. So according to that take on Capital, this is actually the last chapter in the book. So significant, and as I've said a few times, it is the second longest in the entire book. And it'll take us 2 weeks to go through the whole thing if you're listening in real time in September 2025. But anyway, without further ado, let's begin chapter 25. Section 1. The increased demand for labor power that accompanies accumulation, the composition of capital remaining the same. In this chapter, we consider the influence of the growth of capital on the lot of the laboring class. The most important factor in this inquiry is the composition of capital and the changes it undergoes in the course of the process of accumulation. The composition of capital is to be understood in a twofold sense. On the side of value, it's determined by the proportion in which it's divided into constant capital, or value of the means of production, and variable capital, or value of labor power, the sum total of wages. On the side of material, as it functions in the process of production, all capital is divided into means of production and living labor power. This latter composition is determined by the relation between the mass of the means of production employed on the one hand, and the mass of labor necessary for their employment on the other. I call the former the value composition, the latter the technical composition of capital. Between the two, there is a strict correlation. To express this, I call the value composition of capital, insofar as it's determined by its technical composition and mirrors the change of the latter, the organic composition of capital. Wherever I refer to the composition of capital, without further qualification, its organic composition is always understood. So, commenting, when we talk about the composition of capital, there are two sides of that, and those two sides are in relation, but before we get to the relationship, the one side is the constant capital, or the equipment, and the other side is the variable capital, or the labor. Now, as Marx points out, the equipment that you have, the quantity of it, and the exact nature of the equipment determines how much labor you're going to need. So as Marx says, the composition of capital is to be understood in a twofold sense. The first side of that is value. We can break that down by saying uppercase C is equal to lowercase c over lowercase v. We remember that uppercase C, or total capital laid out, can be broken down into lowercase c, constant capital portion, and or plus lowercase v, the variable capital portion, constant capital being the equipment, and the variable capital being the wages paid to the laborers using the equipment. So if we set it up as a ratio, C to V or C over V, then we can compare how much of the capital is in the constant portion and how much of the capital is in the variable or wages portion. Then there is the technical composition of capital. This does not concern the value. It concerns, to quote Marx again, the relation between the mass of the means of production employed and the mass of labor necessary for their employment. So in this sense, we are still talking about constant capital and variable capital, in that we're talking about the means of production and the labor necessary to operate the means of production. But here we're looking more at the qualitative side. So if you're having flashbacks here to chapter 1 and the twofold nature of the commodity, the one fold, if you will, being the qualitative use value, or the material characteristics of the thing as it exists, and then the other side being the quantitative value and exchange value side, which has more to do with the amount of socially necessary labor time that thing embodies. Here I would say we have something similar with the value composition of capital, relating more to that quantitative side, and the technical composition of capital relating more to the qualitative side. In other words, the means of production have particular qualities to them, as do human laborers and human labor power. You have certain means of production, and it takes a certain amount of people. I know that amount implies quantitative, but basically you've got a machine, you've got multiple machines, and then you've got a certain amount of laborers, which depending on how those machines are operated, which is again more of a qualitative question, will call into the production process a certain number of laborers. For example, if you have a machine, to take a very micro level example, that 4 people can operate, well, only 4 people can be called into that process of production at any given time, just due to the nature of the work. Ultimately, we are concerned when we're talking about the technical composition of capital with amounts, as Marx says, the mass of the means of production employed and the mass of labor necessary for their employment. So he is ultimately looking at the quantity, but we're not interested here in the value behind what it took to produce them or what that represents in the value or the amount of labor it took to produce all of this or the capital invested in it. We're just talking about, with the technical composition of capital, how many buildings, how many machines, how much raw materials, and then how many workers employed, how many hours do they work, etc. Now, Marx makes this distinction because you can have a change in the one without having a change in the other. So, for example, the technical composition of capital could stay the same number of buildings, same number of workers, schedule remains unchanged. Everything about the physical production process is staying the same. However, if there's a change in the cost of labor power, then your variable capital to constant capital ratio could be different. Without a change in anything pertaining to the means of production, then your value composition of capital has changed. And as Marx points out, changes in the technical composition of capital can drive some of the changes in the value composition of capital. As Marx says, quote, between the two, the value composition of capital and the technical composition of capital, there is a strict correlation. To express this, I call the value composition of capital insofar as it's determined by its technical composition and mirrors the changes of the latter. This is the organic composition of capital. And then he says, whenever I refer to the composition of capital, just using that term, that's what he means. The organic composition of capital, which again is the value composition of capital insofar as it's mirroring the changes in the technical composition of capital. We're going to be discussing this throughout the chapter, but hopefully that gives you enough to at least continue for now at least. Continuing. The many individual capitals invested in a particular branch of production have, one with another, more or less different compositions. The average of their individual compositions gives us the composition of the total capital in this branch of production. Lastly, the average of these averages in all branches of production gives us the composition of the total social capital of a country, and with this alone we are, in the last resort, concerned in the following investigation. Growth of capital involves growth of its variable constituent or of the part invested in labor power. A part of the surplus value turned into additional capital must always be retransformed into variable capital or additional labor fund. If we suppose that, all other circumstances remaining the same, the composition of capital also remains constant, i.e. that a definite mass of means of production constantly needs the same mass of labor power to set it in motion, then the demand for labor and the subsistence fund of the laborers clearly increase in the same proportion as the capital, and the more rapidly the capital increases. Since the capital produces yearly a surplus value, of which one part is yearly added to the original capital, since this increment itself grows yearly along with the augmentation of the capital already functioning, since lastly, under special stimulus to enrichment, such as the opening of new markets or of new spheres for the outlay of capital, in consequence of newly developed social wants, etc., the scale of accumulation may be suddenly extended, merely by a change in the division of the surplus value or surplus product into capital and revenue. The requirements of accumulating capital may exceed the increase of labor power or the number of laborers. The demand for laborers may exceed the supply, and therefore wages may rise. This must indeed ultimately be the case if the conditions supposed above continue. For since in each year more laborers are employed than in its predecessor, sooner or later a point must be reached at which the requirements of accumulation begin to surpass the customary supply of labor, and therefore a rise of wages takes place. A lamentation on this score was heard in England during the whole of the 15th and the first half of the 18th centuries. The more or less favorable circumstances in which the wage-working class supports and multiplies itself in no way alter the fundamental character of capitalist production. As simple reproduction constantly reproduces the capital relation itself, i.e. the relation of capitalists on the one hand and wage workers on the other, so reproduction on a progressive scale, i.e. accumulation, reproduces the capital relation on a progressive scale. More capitalists or larger capitalists at this pole, more wage workers at that. The reproduction of a mass of labor power, which must incessantly reincorporate itself with capital for that capital's self-expansion, which cannot get free from capital and whose enslavement to capital is only concealed by the variety of individual capitalists to whom it sells itself. This reproduction of labor power forms, in fact, an essential element of the reproduction of capital itself. Accumulation of capital is, therefore, increase of the proletariat. Footnote quoting Collin, Political Economy, Source of Revolutions and Utopias, So-Called Socialists, Paris, 1857. With equal oppression of the masses, the more proletarians a country has, the richer it is, unquote. Our proletarian is economically none other than the wage laborer, who produces and increases capital and is thrown out on the streets as soon as they are superfluous for the needs of aggrandizement of Mr. Capital, as Pecqueur calls this person. The, quote, sickly proletarian of the primitive forest is a pretty Rocherian fancy. The primitive forester is owner of the primitive forest and uses the primitive forest as their property with the freedom of an orangutan. They are not, therefore, a proletarian. This would only be the case if the primitive forest exploited them instead of being exploited by them. As far as their health is concerned, such a person would well bear comparison, not only with the modern proletarian, but also with the syphilitic and scrofulous upper classes. But no doubt Herr Wilhelm Roscher by primitive forest means his native heath of Lüneburg. Back to the main text. Classical economy grasped this fact so thoroughly that Adam Smith, Ricardo, etc., as mentioned earlier, inaccurately identified accumulation with the consumption, by the productive laborers, of all the capitalized part of the surplus product, or with its transformation into additional wage laborers. As early as 1696, John Bellers says, quote, "For if one had 100,000 acres of land, and as many pounds in money, and as many cattle, without a laborer, what would the rich man be but a laborer? And as the laborers make men rich, so the more laborers there will be, the more rich men, the labor of the poor being the minds of the rich," unquote. So also Bernard de Mandeville at the beginning of the 18th century, quote, "It would be easier, where property is well secured, to live without money than without poor. For who would do the work? As they, the poor, ought to be kept from starving, so they should receive nothing worth saving. If here and there one of the lowest class by uncommon industry, and pinching his belly, lifts himself above the condition he was brought up in, nobody ought to hinder him. Nay, it is undeniably the wisest course for every person in the society, and for every private family to be frugal. But it is the interest of all rich nations that the greatest part of the poor should almost never be idle, and yet continually spend what they get." Comment is really laying it all out there. Continuing, "Those that get their living by their daily labor have nothing to stir them up to be serviceable but their wants which it is prudence to relieve, but folly to cure." Comment. Okay, no, that is laying it all out there. Continuing. "The only thing then that can render the laboring man industrious is a moderate quantity of money, for as too little will, according as his temper is, either dispirit him or make him desperate, so too much will make him insolent and lazy." What the fuck are you? Anyway, from what has been said, it is manifest that, in a free nation where slaves are not allowed of, the surest wealth consists in a multitude of laborious poor, for besides that they are the never-failing nursery of fleets and armies. Without them there could be no enjoyment, and no product of any country could be valuable. Quote, "To make the society," which Marx adds, of course consists of non-workers, "happy, and people easier under the meanest circumstances, it is requisite that great numbers of them should be ignorant as well as poor. Knowledge both enlarges and multiplies our desires, and the fewer things a man wishes for, the more easily his necessities may be supplied," unquote. And there's a footnote that's from Bernard de Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, 5th edition, London, 1728. And quoting an essay on trade and commerce, quote, "Temperate living and constant employment is the direct road for the poor to rational happiness," Marx adds, by which he most probably means long working days and little means of subsistence, quote, "and to riches and strength for the state," Marx adds, viz. For the landlords, capitalists, and their political dignitaries and agents. Back to the main text. What Mandeville, an honest, clear-headed man, had not yet seen is that the mechanism of the process of accumulation itself increases, along with the capital, the mass of, quote, "laboring poor," i.e. the wage laborers, who turned their labor power into an increasing power of self-expansion of the growing capital, and even by doing so, must eternize their dependent relation on their own product, as personified in the capitalists. In reference to this relation of dependence, Sir F.M. Eden, in his The State of the Poor, A History of the Laboring Classes in England, says, quote, "The natural produce of our soil is certainly not fully adequate to our subsistence. We can neither be clothed, lodged, nor fed, but in consequence of some previous labor. A portion at least of the society must be indefatigably employed. There are others who, though they, quote, neither toil nor spin, can yet command the produce of industry, but who owe their exemption from labor solely to civilization and order." Comment that is one way of putting it. Continuing, "They are peculiarly the creatures of civil institutions, which have recognized that individuals may acquire property by various other means besides the exertion of labor." Footnote, Eden should have asked, whose creatures then are the, quote, civil institutions? From his standpoint of juridical illusion, he does not regard the law as a product of the material relations of production, but conversely the relations of production as products of the law. Langay overthrew Montesquieu's illusory spirit of the laws with one word. The spirit of laws is property. Back to the main text and continuing the quote, "Persons of independent fortune owe their superior advantages by no means to any superior abilities of their own, but almost entirely to the industry of others. It is not the possession of land or of money, but the command of labor which distinguishes the opulent from the laboring part of the community. This," Marx adds, "scheme approved by Eden, would give the people of property sufficient, but by no means too much, influence and authority over those who work for them, and it would place such laborers not in an abject or servile condition, but in such a state of easy and liberal dependence as all who know human nature and its history will allow to be necessary for their own comfort." Unquote. Sir F.M. Eden, it may be remarked in passing, is the only disciple of Adam Smith during the 18th century that produced any work of importance. Footnote, if the reader reminds me of Malthus, whose essay on population appeared in 1798, I remind him that this work in its first form is nothing more than a schoolboyish, superficial plagiary of Defoe, Sir James Stewart, Townsend, Franklin, Wallace, etc., and does not contain a single sentence thought out by himself. The great sensation this pamphlet caused was due solely to party interest. The French Revolution had found passionate defenders in the United Kingdom. The, quote, principle of population, slowly worked out in the 18th century and then, in the midst of a great social crisis, proclaimed with drums and trumpets as the infallible antidote to the teachings of Condorcet, etc., was greeted with jubilance by the English oligarchy as the great destroyer of all hankerings after human development. Malthus, hugely astonished at his success, gave himself to stuffing into his book materials superficially compiled and adding to it new matter, not discovered but annexed by him. Note further, although Malthus was a parson of the English state church, he had taken the monastic vow of celibacy, one of the conditions of holding a fellowship in Protestant Cambridge University. This circumstance favorably distinguishes Malthus from the other Protestant parsons, who have shuffled off the command enjoining celibacy of the priesthood and have taken "be fruitful and multiply" as their special biblical mission in such a degree that they generally contribute to the increase of population to a really unbecoming extent, whilst they preach at the same time to the laborers the, quote, principle of population. It is characteristic that the economic fall of man, the Adam's apple, the urgent appetite, the, quote, checks which tend to blunt the shafts of Cupid, as Parson Townsend waggishly puts it, that this delicate question was and is monopolized by the reverends of Protestant theology, or rather of the Protestant Church. With the exception of the Venetian monk, Ortez, an original and clever writer, most of the population theory teachers are Protestant parsons. For instance, Bruckner, Theory of the Animal System, 1767, in which the whole subject of the modern population theory is exhausted, and to which the passing quarrel between Quesnay and his pupil, the elder Mirabeau, furnished ideas on the same topic. Then Parson Wallace, Parson Townsend, Parson Malthus, and his pupil, the archparson, Thomas Chalmers, to say nothing of lesser reverend scribblers in this line. Originally, political economy was studied by philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, Hume, by businessmen and statesmen like Thomas More, Temple, Sully, DeWitt, North, Law, Vanderlyn, Cantillon, Franklin, and especially, and with the greatest success, by medical men like Petty, Barbon, Mandeville, Quesnay. Even in the middle of the 18th century, the Reverend Mr. Tucker, a notable economist of his time, excused himself for meddling with the things of mammon. Later on, and in truth with this very principle of population, struck the hour of the Protestant parsons. Petty, who regarded the population as the basis of wealth, and was, like Adam Smith, an outspoken foe to Parsons, says, as if he had a presentiment of their bungling interference, quote, that religion best flourishes when the priests are most mortified, as was before said of the law, which best flourisheth when lawyers have least to do, unquote. He advises the Protestant priests, therefore, if they, once for all, will not follow the Apostle Paul and mortify themselves by celibacy, quote, not to breed more churchmen than the benefices, as they now stand shared out, will receive. That is to say, if there be places for about 12,000 in England and Wales, it will not be safe to breed up 24,000 ministers, for then the 12,000 which are unprovided for will seek ways how to get themselves a livelihood, which they cannot do more easily than by persuading the people that the 12,000 incumbents do poison or starve their souls, and misguide them in their way to heaven, unquote. That's from Petty's A Treatise of Taxes and Contributions, 1667. Adam Smith's position with the Protestant priesthood of his time is shown by the following. In A Letter to A. Smith, LL.D., on the life, death, and philosophy of his friend David Hume, by one of the people called Christians, 4th edition, 1784, Dr. Horne, Bishop of Norwich, reproves Adam Smith because in a published letter to Mr. Strahan, he, quote, embalmed his friend David, meaning Hume, because he told the world how, quote, Hume amused himself on his deathbed with Lucian and whist, unquote, and because he even had the impudence to write of Hume, quote, I have always considered him, both in his lifetime and since his death, as approaching as nearly to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man as perhaps the nature of human frailty will permit, unquote. The bishop cries out in a passion, quote, is it right in you, sir, to hold up to our view as perfectly wise and virtuous the character and conduct of one who seems to have been possessed with an incurable antipathy to all that is called religion, and who strained every nerve to explode, suppress, and extirpate the spirit of it among men, that its very name, if he could effect it, might no more be had in remembrance, unquote. Quote, but let not the lovers of truth be discouraged. Atheism cannot be of long continuance, unquote. Adam Smith, quote, had the atrocious wickedness to propagate atheism through the land, viz. By his theory of moral sentiments. Upon the whole, doctor, your meaning is good, but I think you will not succeed this time. You would persuade us, by the example of David Hume, Esquire, that atheism is the only cordial for low spirits, and the proper antidote against the fear of death. You may smile over Babylon in ruins, and congratulate the hardened Pharaoh on his overthrow in the Red Sea, unquote. One orthodox individual amongst Adam Smith's college friends writes after his death, quote, Smith's well-placed affection for Hume hindered him from being a Christian. When he met with honest men whom he liked, he would believe almost anything they said. Had he been a friend of the worthy ingenious Horrocks, he would have believed that the moon sometimes disappeared in a clear sky without the interposition of a cloud. He approached to republicanism in his political principles, unquote. That's quoting The Bee by James Anderson, 18 volumes, volume 3, 1791-93. Parson Thomas Chalmers has his suspicions as to Adam Smith having invented the category of, quote, unproductive laborers solely for the Protestant parsons, in spite of their blessed work in the vineyard of the Lord. And commenting, I think that footnote was longer than some of the audiobooks that we've done on the channel. Anyway, back to the main text. Under the conditions of accumulation supposed thus far, which conditions are those most favorable to the laborers, their relation of dependence upon capital takes on a form endurable or, as Eden says, quote, easy and liberal. Instead of becoming more intensive with the growth of capital, this relation of dependence only becomes more extensive, i.e. the sphere of capital's exploitation and rule merely extends with its own dimensions and the number of its subjects. A larger part of their own surplus product, always increasing and continually transformed into additional capital, comes back to them in the shape of means of payment, so that they can extend the circle of their enjoyments, can make some additions to their consumption fund of clothes, furniture, etc., and can lay by small reserve funds of money. But just as little as better clothing, food and treatment, and a larger peculium do away with the exploitation of the slave, so little do they set aside that of the wage worker. A rise in the price of labor, as a consequence of accumulation of capital, only means in fact that the length and weight of the golden chain the wage worker has already forged for himself allow of a relaxation of the tension of it. In the controversies on the subject, the chief fact has generally been overlooked, viz. The defining characteristic of capitalistic production. Labor power is sold today not with the view of satisfying, by its service or by its product, the personal needs of the buyer. Their aim is augmentation of their capital, production of commodities containing more labor than they pay for, containing therefore a portion of value that costs them nothing, and that is nevertheless realized when the commodities are sold. Production of surplus value is the absolute law of this mode of production. Labor power is only saleable so far as it preserves the means of production in their capacity of capital, reproduces its own value as capital, and yields in unpaid labor a source of additional capital. Footnote, quoting John Wade, the limit, however, to the employment of both the operative and the laborer is the same, namely the possibility of the employer realizing a profit on the produce of their industry. If the rate of wages is such as to reduce the master's gains below the average profit of capital, they will cease to employ them, or they will only employ them on condition of submission to a reduction of wages. Unquote. Back to the main text. The conditions of its sale, whether more or less favorable to the laborer, include therefore the necessity of its constant reselling, and the constant extended reproduction of all wealth in the shape of capital. Wages, as we have seen, by their very nature, always imply the performance of a certain quantity of unpaid labor on the part of the laborer. Altogether, irrespective of the case of a rise of wages with a falling price of labor, etc., such an increase only means at best a quantitative diminution of the unpaid labor that the worker has to supply. This diminution can never reach the point at which it would threaten the system itself. Apart from violent conflicts as to the rate of wages, and Adam Smith has already shown that in such a conflict, taken on the whole, the master is always master, a rise in the price of labor resulting from accumulation of capital implies the following alternative. Either the price of labor keeps on rising, because its rise does not interfere with the progress of accumulation. In this, there is nothing wonderful, for, says Adam Smith, quote, after these profits are diminished, stock may not only continue to increase, but to increase much faster than before. A great stock, though with small profits, generally increases faster than a small stock with great profits, unquote. In this case, it is evident that a diminution in the unpaid labor in no way interferes with the extension of the domain of capital. Or, on the other hand, accumulation slackens in consequence of the rise in the price of labor because the stimulus of gain is blunted. The rate of accumulation lessens, but with its lessening, the primary cause of that lessening vanishes, i.e. the disproportion between capital and exploitable labor power. The mechanism of the process of capitalist production removes the very obstacles that it temporarily creates. The price of labor falls again to a level corresponding with the needs of the self-expansion of capital, whether the level be below, the same as, or above the one which was normal before the rise of wages took place. We see thus, in the first case, it is not the diminished rate either of the absolute or of the proportional increase in labor power, or laboring population, which causes capital to be in excess, but conversely the excess of capital that makes exploitable labor power insufficient. In the second case, it is not the increased rate either of the absolute or of the proportional increase in labor power or laboring population that makes capital insufficient, but conversely, the relative diminution of capital that causes the exploitable labor power, or rather its price, to be in excess. It is these absolute movements of the accumulation of capital which are reflected as relative movements of the mass of exploitable labor power, and therefore seem produced by the latter's own independent movement. To put it mathematically, the rate of accumulation is the independent, not the dependent variable. The rate of wages, the dependent, not the independent variable. Thus, when the industrial cycle is in the phase of crisis, a general fall in the price of commodities is expressed as a rise in the value of money, and in the phase of prosperity, a general rise in the price of commodities as a fall in the value of money. The so-called currency school concludes from this that with high prices too much, with low prices too little money is in circulation. Footnote, a note by the Institute of Marxism-Leninism to the Russian edition. The manuscript in the first case says little, and in the second case much. The correction has been introduced according to the authorized French translation. Back to the main text. Their ignorance and complete misunderstanding of facts are worthily paralleled by the economists, who interpret the above phenomena of accumulation by saying that there are now too few, now too many wage laborers. The law of capitalist production that is at the bottom of the pretended, quote, natural law of population reduces itself simply to this. The correlation between accumulation of capital and rate of wages is nothing else than the correlation between the unpaid labor transformed into capital and the additional paid labor necessary for the setting in motion of this additional capital. It is therefore in no way a relation between two magnitudes independent one of the other. On the one hand, the magnitude of the capital, on the other, the number of the laboring population. It is rather at bottom only the relation between the unpaid and the paid labor of the same laboring population. if the quantity of unpaid labor supplied by the working class and accumulated by the capitalist class increases so rapidly that its conversion into capital requires an extraordinary addition of paid labor, then wages rise, and all other circumstances remaining equal, the unpaid labor diminishes in proportion. But as soon as this diminution touches the point at which the surplus labor that nourishes capital is no longer supplied in normal quantity, a reaction sets in. A smaller part of revenue is capitalized, accumulation lags, and the movement of rise in wages receives a check. The rise of wages, therefore, is confined within limits that not only leave intact the foundations of the capitalistic system, but also secure its reproduction on a progressive scale. The law of capitalistic accumulation, metamorphosed by economists into pretended law of nature, in reality merely states that the very nature of accumulation excludes every diminution in the degree of exploitation of labor, and every rise in the price of labor, which could seriously imperil the continual reproduction, on an ever-enlarging scale, of the capitalistic relation. It cannot be otherwise in a mode of production in which the labor exists to satisfy the needs of self-expansion of existing values, instead of, on the contrary, material wealth existing to satisfy the needs of development on the part of the laborer. As in religion humans are governed by the products of their own brain, so in capitalistic production they are governed by the products of their own hand. Footnote, quoting von Thunen, if we now return to our first inquiry, wherein it was shown that capital itself is only the result of human labor, it seems quite incomprehensible that man can have fallen under the domination of capital, his own product, can be subordinated to it. And as in reality this is beyond dispute the case, involuntarily the question arises, how has the laborer been able to pass from being master of capital, as its creator, to being its slave? Unquote. It is Thunen's merit to have asked this question. His answer is simply childish.